Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining for Pecan Street's webinar on soil carbon sequestration and regenerative agriculture. We're going to give folks just a minute to join, but while they do, just a reminder that you can submit questions through the chat function or the Q&A function in Zoom. And then we've reserved plenty of time at the end of the presentations for Q&A. So feel free to submit those and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. And with that, I think we can probably go ahead and kick things off. So I'm going to hand it over to our moderator, Suzanne Russo, who is Pecan Street's CEO.
Thanks, Clayton. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this discussion of how soils can help solve the climate crisis. We're thrilled to be hosting this discussion with some of the leading thinkers and doers in this space. Just some quick housekeeping notes before we get going. We would love to hear your questions and comments throughout the course of this talk. Clayton, can you go to the next slide, please? Thanks. And to do that, just use the chat function that's at the bottom of the screen on Zoom. And I'll do my best to get to the questions that are raised throughout this discussion today. And next slide, please. If you'd like to send any questions over or any suggestions after the end of this webinar, please feel free to shoot an email either to our media team or to me directly. We'd love to hear from you. And you can sign up for notifications on all of our webinars if you're not already on our listserv at our website, pecanstreet.org. I'm not going to talk too much today about Pecan Street's work in this space on soils for a climate solution. We'll have another webinar on that and follow up, but if you want to keep track of that program, we also have more information about that on our website as well. And we have such amazing speakers today. I'm going to turn it over to them as fast as I can. Each of the speakers is going to present, and I'll give you a brief introduction to them before they pop up on the screen. And then we'll have time for a really interesting panel discussion as well. So our first speaker, I'm so pleased to introduce her to you, Dr. Lakeisha Odom. Dr. Odom holds a PhD in integrated bioscience, and since 2016, she has been the science director at the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, where she's having a profound impact on the science of our soils for farming and ranching, as well as solutions to help farming become more profitable and efficient into the 21st century. Dr. Odom has focused a lot on the application of innovative science and integrative thinking, interdisciplinary thinking, to solving the complex challenges that currently face farmers and ranchers, including climate change. And I'm thrilled she's going to talk with you to introduce the opportunity that we have to help mitigate climate change with our soils, and also what needs to be done to be able to seize this opportunity and how FAR is helping us to do that. Dr. Odom, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be a part of this conversation. And I'm glad that Suzanne said opportunity so many times, because I'm going to say it even more throughout this conversation. So next slide, please. Thank you. So I was asked to provide a little bit of setting of the stage before the rest of our excellent panel comes in and gives more detail. So what I want to do is give just a couple of seconds on who we are at the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, because that very much, I think, sets the tone for the perspective that I'll present, and then we can talk about what FAR is doing at the end of the presentation. But I want to spend a little bit of time talking about those challenges and opportunities to reduce emissions in the farming sector and the potential, and then how do we seize or capitalize on these opportunities in the space. Next step. Next slide, please. So a little bit about FAR, for those of you who are unfamiliar, we're a nonprofit independent 501c3. We were created in the 2014 Farm Bill with the objective of spurring innovation and collaboration. We were given an initial investment of $200 million in the 2014 Farm Bill and an additional $185 million in the 2018 Farm Bill. And basically we were created to find those spaces of innovation, identify research gaps, and remain complementary and not duplicative to USDA. Next slide, please. So we envision a world in which ever innovative and collaborative science can provide every person access to affordable, nutritious food grown on thriving farms. Next slide. And we accomplish our vision through our mission, which is creating unique partnerships that help to support innovative science as we address today's challenges in food and agriculture. Next slide, please. And the way that we accomplish this is through not only creating innovative or unique public-private partnerships, but creating novel research partnerships. We are able to work nimbly and efficiently to address emerging issues. We were provided with a mandate that for every dollar that we spend of our own corpus, we find a non-federal match. So that allows us to leverage public dollars with private dollars in order to expand our research impact. And then we look for those research gaps that support farms, reduce food security, improve health. And the areas in which I'm most focused on is soil health and climate. So that's the lens in which I'll share information with you today. Next slide. And one more time. Yep, perfect. So over the last 4 years that I've been at the organization, we've developed over 400 distinctive partnerships in an effort to fund projects from soil health to sustainable water management, advanced animal systems, urban food, health and ag, and as well as next generation crops or crop genomics. So we work in a wide range in the ag sector, but we're always centered on finding those innovative spaces, those opportunities for partnership, and then addressing these larger challenges in the ag sector. Next slide. So now we get to the great part, right? The transition into talking about the challenges and opportunities that we face in this soil health regenerative ag space. So I will kind of tailor my conversation a little bit to really focus on just those challenges and opportunities. Next slide. So I have this slide here because what you will see in a lot of my conversation is that I might move quickly past some of the making the case for climate and soil health and regenerative ag, because I think I'll be preaching to the choir. Most of you are probably here today because to some extent you understand and accept that soil health practices that support regenerative ag are key to the future of agriculture. So when I move quickly past these pieces, it's not because they're not important, but because I believe that we are maybe aligned in that space. And so there are some other interesting trends around challenge and opportunities that I would love to share. Next slide, please. So this is my one comprehensive slide that shows the multiple effects of global warming and climate disruption on agriculture. We have agriculture in the middle trying to remain productive and profitable to farmers and ranchers, and all of these various factors, these complicated objectives to consider while thinking about things like nutrition needs, food insecurity, biodiversity, and you can put a big sticker across this whole slide that said COVID-19, because now on top of all the other shocks to the system, we also have to consider how global-wide pandemics affect our food system. So there are a lot of factors that are in this space that are affecting ag productivity, but there are some potential solutions. Next slide, please. So in thinking about what could be done, we recognize that according to IPCC, we need a rapid and far-reaching transition, and we need to think about ways that we can stabilize greenhouse gas concentration. And that's one of the greatest environmental challenges of the century. And I read this quote and I was really taken aback in that it really is a huge call to arms and call to action to really think about how we can stabilize these concentrations. And again, according to an additional study by IPCC, there's a lot of opportunity in building soil carbon, and they listed it as one of the most significant climate actions in our land use sector. So then thinking about the ways that we know that there are current greenhouse gas efficient technologies and practices that can help us achieve this reduction, we know that there's a path forward. Next slide. So at this point, when we're thinking about soil health and regen and why that may be the path forward through these regenerative practices, it's not just enough that we produce foods in ways that minimize harm to the planet. We really need to start producing foods in a way that restore the health of the planet. And so that's why regenerative practices and soil health practices that that support regenerative practices is so key. And we need to think about how soil carbon sequestration through regenerative ag is a human scale remedy to global warming that's ready for implementation now. So we've got these challenges, but we also have a path forward, which is really something that gives me a lot of faith on a day-to-day basis. Next slide. So this is a slide that I saw, but I amended it a little bit. So it says, like, although soils are seemingly unlikely to help us remediate climate change, they are almost essential for us to survive it. But what I really pulled out is that soils are essential for us to survive climate change. They're key, they're foundational, right? And so that's a space where that quote spoke to me, but not quite the way it was written. It was more, I recognize how centered soil health and regenerative practices are to our ability to remediate climate change. Next slide. So, in thinking about why we need this holistic strategy, we know that no single practice or measure works across every geographic region, every commodity. And this is a challenge, but also an opportunity because it allows us to think of taking a more systematic, holistic approach. And now is that exact moment where we see organizations across food systems kind of start to partner together, work together to think about how we can explore these transformative potentials. And I'll share a little bit more about like what we're seeing on the private industry side in a couple of minutes. So we recognize also that the better that we can manage our soil carbon, um, that is effective if we put it in a framework that is multifaceted to try to improve farming methods. And then we have a lot of opportunity in the science and societal space so that we can think about how we can adapt soils and agriculture to our rapidly changing climate. So again, these spaces of opportunity in science and affecting societal change, there's lots of opportunity in thinking about how we could create a multifaceted framework for this work. So next slide. So if we know the answer, or really accurately one of many answers, then why aren't we there yet, right? So I want to transition to spend a little bit of time about talking about some barriers that we recognize are in the space. Next slide. So here are a number of barriers that exist in the space that we know there are limits on the amount of soil carbon sequestration science. There's often a lack of technical assistance. There's large transaction costs sometimes to this effort. There's lack of research focused on the cultural and policy complexities around adopting these practices and around doing the work of this soil carbon sequestration. But each of these barriers to me represents, you guessed it, an opportunity. It represents an opportunity for organizations like my own and a number of the organizations that you'll hear from today or that you're aware of in the space to identify opportunities to fund research. We're a research funding organization, so things around that barrier around lack of research efforts is really exciting for me because that's a space where we can look at how we can figure out what these cultural and policy complexities are, or thinking about the lack of technical assistance. How can we support organizations that provide that technical assistance in an effort to really engage and assist farmers to adopt these practices? Or thinking about the limits of soil carbon sequestration science, right? How can we fund additional research that really elucidates what is possible and then really provides those recommendations that can be provided through technical assistance? So quite a bit of opportunity there, even though these are barriers. Next slide, please. So what I come to at this space is, while we recognize that agriculture has a role to play in greenhouse gas emissions and the production of them, it's really the only sector that has a natural potential to mitigate through innovations like carbon sequestration, but also feed nutrition, manure management. There are a number of areas in the ag sector that allow us to reduce emissions while we can increase farmer productivity and profitability, because that is also a part of our mission as well at FAR. Next slide. So I demonstrated this slide just to show that there's a number of folks that are in this food system that are interested in regenerative agriculture. And I amended it a little because the original slide had farmers and I needed to add ranchers as well. And so but each of these boxes recognizes or represents an actor in the system. And each of these actors represents an opportunity to trigger change, to affect change in this space. So while this space is quite crowded, that for me can be difficult, but I find it more dynamic. So because there are so many people that are interested, engaged, and want to be in these spaces around regenerative agriculture and adoption of these practices, each of these boxes to me represents a potential partner, a potential thought leader, a potential lever of influence in this space. So it's just to recognize there are lots of players in the space, but that represents a lot of opportunity for dynamic engagement in this space. Next slide, please. So we have the opportunity to through working with scientists, farmers, and ranchers to think about how we can develop and deploy more climate smart solutions. Much of this work is already happening, but it's a bit fragmented at times. You saw the previous slide with the number of folks in the space, correct? And so thinking about how we can address climate change really means we need to coordinate these efforts as well as continue to maintain that sense of urgency. And as far as doing some work in the space around addressing that fragmentation, which I'll share in just a minute. Next slide. Thank you. I just wanted to spend 1 minute talking about what's happening in the private sector. So groups like General Mills, Danone, Kellogg, Nestle, Land O'Lakes, they're all working in this regenerative ag space. They've all adopted or joined together in coalitions to either reduce or build biodiversity or affect their supply chain. However, the changes that they're trying to make need to be more integrated, and there's a need to have less of a piecemeal kind of company pledged approach and having a more integrated, broader climate strategy. So again, crowded space, lots of exciting activity, but there might be a need to coordinate and kind of have those efforts be a bit less piecemeal. So next slide. So that moves perfectly into what FAR specifically is doing. Next slide. So FAR has developed an opportunity called the Agricultural Climate Partnership, where we want to see every farmer and rancher deploy climate smart solutions on every acre of farmland. And the goal is to have U.S. agriculture be net negative for greenhouse gas emissions. And we want to do that by mobilizing not only scientists, but farmers and ranchers to assist us in unlocking climate solving potential in our farmlands. Next slide. This effort is a collaborative approach between USFRA, the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action, FAR, and the World Farming Organization. Next slide. And we hope to do that through a data discovery where we look at opportunities to understand what exists in the space, knowledge transfer, and farmer adoption. So we have build the base where we want to pull groups together. We want to look at the availability of data integration and intelligence. We hope to create a climate smart activation platform that could provide site-specific recommendations and track the resilience on every acre, on every farm, and accelerate adoption, and then hopefully expand globally. So these are our 5 phases to achieve net negative emissions. So I think that the thing I would love to leave you with is this impression that there's a lot of movement in this space. There are lots of things we understand, but there's still some spaces where there are some research gaps that we hope to fill. And overall, objectively, we hope to move from challenge to change, right? We want to look at those opportunities. These barriers is nothing more than opportunities to partner, to collaborate, and then to affect change. Final slide, please. So I just want to take a moment to thank you so much for your time. If you have any follow-up questions, here's my information. And then if there's more information that you would like on our climate work, there's additional information provided there. I trust, Suzanne, that the slides will be shared with the whole group if people would like them. Good, perfect. So that's my time. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I hope this has been somewhat useful. I've enjoyed having a conversation with you all.
Thank you, Dr. Odom. Don't go off screen yet. I have one quick question for you before we move on to the next panelist. There's so many benefits that you outline with regenerative agriculture. reducing emissions, increasing resiliency to climate change in our food system, increasing farmer revenue. I mean, it just seems like a win-win-win to infinity. What do you think is the biggest challenge to widespread adoption of these practices? If you had to
So
name one.
I do. I think that it's a complicated answer because it's not just a scientific one, right? There's so many triggers along the supply chain. Um, is there crop insurance for them to adopt, for farmers or ranchers to adopt these practices? Do they have the right technical assistance? Policies aren't set up quite yet to reward them. There are some ecosystems market work to provide some compensation, but that's in the making. So I think that there are a number of factors that affect human behavior and adoption of these practices that we don't know enough about. And that's part of what we want to do with our Ag Climate platform, is really dig into what are those societal, socioeconomic factors that really drive change. We know that cover crops can be beneficial. So why isn't everyone adopting them? Because there are other triggers that affect our ability to adopt, right? It's not just this is a thing that you should do. We haven't always proven the best return on investment for adopting these practices. So I think that that is what I'm hearing from not just our organization, but a number of other NGOs and a number of other companies. We're all struggling with how do we facilitate the adoption and make it. We think about adoption like it's centered on the farmer or the rancher, but the reality is there are a number of factors that they cannot affect that influence their ability to adopt. So we need to think about even adoption in a systematic, regenerative way, I think, and thinking about how to enable and support the adoption of these practices. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I always love talking with you. I'm looking forward to the panel discussion when we can hear more from you. Thank you so much for that wonderful overview. It was fantastic. Our next speaker is Dr. Johannes Lehmann. Dr. Lehmann is a professor at Cornell University in the School of Integrative Plant Science, where he focuses on soil biogeochemistry and soil fertility. Dr. Lehmann's also been one of my mentors over the past couple of years in helping me understand how Pecan Street's model of generating and using data to help solve climate problems in advanced markets could be useful in the space of getting widespread adoption of climate beneficial farming practices. But Dr. Lehmann's also one of the pioneers in helping the world better understand how soils work and what that soil microbiome looks like and what is its role in all of these processes that we're talking about with soil fertility and climate resiliency. So I'm really excited that he's joining us today to talk more about his work, as well as some of the data gaps that exist that might be inhibiting development of markets for these kinds of farming practices that promote soil health and provide a climate benefit. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Johannes. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Thank you so much for introduction and for organizing this exciting panel. I'm really excited to be part of it. I want to start with, on the next slide, with saying what everybody probably already knows, that there is more organic carbon in soils than in global vegetation and the atmosphere combined, and by a long shot. So that means a small change in soil organic carbon makes a big change for atmospheric carbon dioxide. And that's really an insight that lay bare for a long time, but has only sunk in the last few years, that might translate into an opportunity that we should look at. But soils have also other functions, and soil carbon is probably the parameter that you would mention if you're talking about soil health or soil fertility, the ability of the soil to provide clean drinking water and other services. It is, when we look at the opportunities to increase soil carbon, then we are typically looking at two opportunities. One is adding more carbon, and the other is to reduce the losses of carbon by mineralization, microbial mineralization to the atmosphere. And those are two aspects of it that I want to develop a little bit further, and explain some of the knowledge gaps and opportunities for moving forward. I also want to make it very clear that when we're talking about soil carbon to withdraw CO2 from the atmosphere, that really only makes sense in concert with emission reductions from fossil fuel use, because we cannot compensate for those emissions, and we need to be very clear about that. Those are not step 1 and step 2. Those are really part of the same step, because we need to do both. On the next slide, I want to highlight that we are really looking at a complex system of space, time, and form. Biomass, that is the input, carbon input to soils, is highly spatially variable. It changes over the course of the year. At least in the US, we're headed into winter. That's very little growing, at least in upstate New York. And the forms are very variable across space. They serve many different purposes that compete for the use. If you think about food versus fuel versus feeding the soil, and soil properties vary as well in space and time. So we are really looking at a very complex system to manage soil carbon. And soil health and soil ecosystem services, as I mentioned earlier, are multifunctional. In some cases, they experience trade-offs where we need to look at optimization and cannot look at only one aspect of soil carbon management. Over the last 10 years, on the next slide, we have really learned a lot more about basic soil organic matter science. And we've ushered in a paradigm shift in the last 20 years that goes away from looking at soil organic matter as a product of what at some time was called humification, that produces humic substances that are recalcitrant in soil and therefore accumulating. That is a concept that doesn't hold anymore, but rather recognizing that soil organic carbon exists because of the complex interplay of a high diversity of biota, a high diversity of molecules, an ever-changing landscape of conditions in time and space. And that really brought into focus that we cannot put with biological carbon sequestration some carbon form into soil and walk away and say it's there and it's locked away. But it is really about constant care, site-specific constant care. And that requires a knowledge system that takes into account both the opportunities for diverse carbon inputs as well as for the diversity of soils itself and managing to reduce outputs. But outputs are part of a healthy soil ecosystem. So the conceiving soil carbon and soils as a storage vessel for organic matter is the wrong concept. On the next slide, I want to introduce different sequestration systems types, and they are shown here with these different dashed boxes. We can think about adding carbon to increase soil organic matter, and these are very often lateral redistribution, such as compost or biochar. Then we, of course, need to look at the biomass system and what the competitive uses are there. Any conversion systems, whether it's biological or thermochemical, and then transportation. And all these can have emission reductions or emission increases associated with it. And then there are other systems that I called here cropland management, where we are managing carbon intrinsically in a cropland. And then, of course, we have set-asides or wetland restorations, where actually moving from one system into another to change soil organic carbon, very often then also with water management. Those you can already immediately appreciate. There are changes in practice involved that we could monitor. And in some cases, we probably need to look at soil organic carbon stocks. And in most cases, probably the answer is we want to do both in some kind of fashion. You also start to appreciate that for some of those, there's really a systems view necessary. And that's usually, we talk about that with words such as a life cycle assessment, because there are many moving parts. For instance, when we have lateral carbon transfers that we need to appreciate and count, and those will also create discussions about where's the boundary of our system that we are looking at. And then there's not only the carbon that we seek to sequester in soil, but there are other emissions that are carbon, such as methane, that are more potent than CO2, and then there's N2O, a nitrogen gas that has a greenhouse gas effect. So we need to recognize all of those, and we can reduce or increase them at many steps during the life cycle of such systems. On the next slide. So if we look at monitoring systems that employ measurements, we can think about that in terms of sampling the soil. That's usually thought of as a no-go for the future, but is of course now what we mostly do. And there are jurisdictions such as in Australia that are actually doing this at the moment with a costly sampling and analysis. But we can also think about in situ carbon measurements, and they start getting to be more interesting because they're more dynamic in time, potentially also in space, and potentially also cheaper. When we analyze samples that we take from the field, we need to analyze them in the lab. Dry combustion is the gold standard for that, but it is very expensive, and many labs have resorted to using cheaper but less accurate methods such as infrared. So those can, of course, then also be combined with direct sampling. The more exciting part, the forward-looking part, is to measure soil organic carbon in situ. Near-infrared is already relatively far advanced, but not as good as mid-infrared, where at the moment the technology is still limping along, and it's mainly a laboratory method, but some handheld devices are already deployable. But there are certainly a lot of technology advances that need to be done. In terms of biological sensors and other physical sensors that have not even been explored fully, in my view, promise a revolution in this area, and are, as I see it, completely untapped. There's more that we don't know. The unknown unknowns are in this area really very, very large. And on the next slide, I want to mention that there is another way of monitoring, and that's practice-based modeling. So we can, as I mentioned earlier, we can monitor not the result of a practice, but just that the practice has happened. That requires, of course, that we know something about the responses to a certain management, and we need to know it for that area, and then we monitor practice. That is considered at the moment the way to go, but I do think that is also in some ways a talk on the street, so to speak, because our efforts in coming up with better monitoring systems has not really worked out so far, and we really need to make this move faster. Here you see results from a study in Ethiopia, where with the help of remote sensing and practice-based modeling using IPCC default factors, you can arrive at estimates of soil carbon changes from a baseline to a certain project with a change in practice. And the costs for such monitoring systems go down significantly, that they are negligible, become negligible compared to the greenhouse gas emission reductions and the tradable units in such a system. I want to close in the next slide with my own rendition of a to-do list on the smaller scale system and more technology intensive part is the development of sensors for soil organic carbon. And as I said, that's a extremely exciting area at the moment, and in my opinion, completely underexplored. But we also need to, at the same time, and that's why we need this collaboration between engineers and soil scientists. It's not enough to just measure something and doing it cheaply and efficiently. We need also to measure something that is relevant for soil organic carbon persistence, but also for what we call soil functional response types. We need to not look at the problem as a static problem, but we not want to know how does soil organic carbon change with change in practices. We need to mold that into what we call models with intent, that are not just scientific models, but that they serve to inform practices, and go beyond the soil carbon model to have, in addition, systems models that recognize that we're in a system that has a boundary that goes beyond the soil carbon profile, and develop in parallel practice-based monitoring systems. But I think it is bracketed by both a practice-based approach as well as the direct measurement approach to cater for the diversity in systems as well as the diversity of landscapes and actors. And with that, I'll stop here, and I look forward to the discussion later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johannes. That was so wonderful and just a fountain of information. I know I'm going to be going back through your slides later to make sure I absorbed everything that you shared. This last slide is just, I think, a wonderful indicator of how far we've come even in the past couple of years in getting some consensus around how we move forward in this opportunity as quickly as possible. Just having these 5 to-do list items laid out here shows progress to me. So I'm excited to talk with you more about that a little bit later. We're going to pivot at this point to talking with Dr. Philip Taylor. As Dr. Odom explained very well, the challenges are both on the technical side as well as on the people side. And we have to have some integrative solutions that build both on our knowledge of the land, our knowledge of systems, better tools, and our understanding of people. So Dr. Philip Taylor is the founder and executive director of Mad Agriculture. Mad Ag is a wonderful organization. If you're not already familiar with it, I suggest getting on their website as soon as we're done here. Mad Ag works directly with farmers to help them on their journey to producing food and animals that work in harmony with their local place, that meet regional needs, that develop community. And Dr. Taylor has a lot of intent in his work, which spans the heart, the head, the land, and community, in creating this real cultural revolution towards what we've been calling regenerative agriculture. I know that term is still a little bit loaded for some people, but I think that's also the term that Mad Ag uses. So I'm going to turn it over to Philip at this point to talk more about their work, the farmer's perspective, and how we create this change that can provide so many benefits to our world, but seems to have a lot of resistance on the path. Thanks again for joining us, Philip.
For sure. Yeah, thanks for having me. I enjoyed the first 2 presentations. And I think what I'll do is I'll quickly summarize what we do and how we work, and then provide just some, I think, calibrating thoughts around the rollout of sort of carbon as a solution to climate change and carbon markets as a solution for paying for that. So, mad agriculture was born out of frustration with how industrial agriculture has treated the earth and treated people. We believe that we need a full-on revolution that's cultural in how we relate to earth. What does right relationship look like with place? How do we reawaken the virtues of stewardship, of rural community, of care, of love, of reciprocity, in the way that we do agriculture? And so my background is actually in academia. I spent 12 years in academia and I have a PhD in soil biogeochemistry and studied the carbon cycle. And so I have a pretty deep sense of how it works from a fundamentals point of view, and have learned a lot of lessons by being on the ground with farmers, trying to activate these ideals of carbon drawdown on the ground, in the field, with the balance sheet, kind of putting the ideals into action. So how we work, we kind of have a 3-tier program that we work with farmers with. The first step with any farmer is really about vision and value alignment, about empowerment. We believe fundamentally that the power for transformation of the world rests in the unrealized potential of each person. It's very much a grassroots awakening concept. And so, you can't tell a farmer what to do. So the way that we work is to empower their ideals that align with our vision of where the world needs to go agriculturally. After that empowerment process, we then work on designing the farm to be regenerative. We're very explicit about the required investments financially, ecologically, socially, and those returns. And so we build systems and design systems that create ecological and financial wealth by being explicit with the balance sheet as well as with the ecological outcomes. We work with John Lundgren, we work with Open Team to understand those ecological outcomes with a focus on tracking and measuring biodiversity and life, as well as the health of the soil with a focus on carbon and water. When it comes to the carbon side of things, we've been working closely with Quick Carbon over the years, which is a handheld IR device that's in development. It's pretty exciting. And then we also blend that with the Comet Farm model. We've worked with Cool Farm a little bit, but primarily Comet Farm has been our lens on carbon outcomes. And so, after we work with a kind of steward at the ground, we do the farm design and the farm design process. We then actually, it's easy to dream big about what your farm could be, but it's very hard to activate that dream. And so we work on 3 primary relationships between the farm and the farmer's vision and the world at large. And those relationships are, what is your community of change? Who do you lean on, laugh with, cry with? What movement are you a part of? The second one is access to capital. We work with farm bill dollars where appropriate. We also just launched a for-profit perennial fund. That's a 10-year operating note for folks to transition to organic and regenerative agriculture. And then that third relationship behind community and capital is access to markets. We work very hard to decommodify every bushel of grain that's produced with the farmers we work with. We really don't like the commodification of nature or the commodification of anything. It works for prices, it works for trade, but I think that the shadow space of commodification is the dehumanizing of the food system, where we lose track of the justice or injustice created by these supply webs that hug the world. And so we work with everyone from Pipeline Foods to Patagonia Provisions, connecting farms to brands to farms, and kind of stitching those supply sheds together while driving more value back into the farmer's pocket as well as to the land. I'll get into the carbon now. We, for a while, because we were building systems that were sequestering carbon, and we had proof of that through collection of data and whether it be through Quick Carbon or whether it be through Comet. We worked with Nori for about 2 years to bring some farmers into those market spaces, and really appreciate that outfit. I appreciate the entire dialogue that's happening right now with the release of the Rodale paper and WRI. How much and what role do soils play in solving climate change is just it's an incredibly robust and vigorous debate that's happening culturally and scientifically. It's been fun to track that. There are a couple high-level concerns that sort of are outside of whether we can measure, monitor, report, and the how much question. The first concern that I have is I feel like, stepping back, that trying to pull carbon into agricultural systems and developing methods for that is sort of like treating a symptom and not the root cause. We have agricultural systems that the way that we have extracted and built them on both human labor and on natural capital really need to be reimagined at the core. We have to ask the big questions of what are we growing food for, and how does it serve for revitalizing the earth? And I say this because I think more now than ever, we need to be dealing with root causes. And I'm not sure that the carbon market does that for a couple of different reasons. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't measure and monitor and know carbon. I think that there are actually many, many other benefits for that. But I've been concerned about the commodification of nature once again by putting carbon on balance sheets as a way of trying to justify the preservation of that carbon over time. It hasn't really worked for tropical rainforests where a lot of these ideas were initially laid out. And I feel like we also are in a period of sort of carbon exuberance. We love the single factor silver bullet solution. And I think we need to take a more holistic approach. And I think that's embodied in much of the work that Johannes has done over the years, where carbon is sort of that central cog of soil health that has to be considered, but it also needs to be considered in relationship to everything else that it brings. And so, you know, the carbon exuberance piece, I fear that we stand to underwhelm society with the ability of soils to solve climate change. You know, I think things like the Terratum Initiative are really ambitious and scientifically impossible. And I hate to be that blunt, but I think it's a time to be honest. And so I want to be honest about what we think soils can actually do and figure out more creative and nuanced and complex ways to communicate that to society. You know, I also think that, you know, we're at a place where, particularly with carbon markets or any kind of carbon payment, around the $10, $15, $20 range is just really, really low. You know, we already know that to put a ton of carbon into the ground is probably $50 or more per acre. And we know that the social cost of carbon is well over $200 an acre, but we're willing to pay 10 or 15. For me, that kind of value disparity, it doesn't make sense. And then I would say just the last piece that I would say as a calibrating force, and I don't mean to be a sort of a Debbie Downer here, is just, I think, creating cost-effective measure and monitoring tools that are tied to certainty at the landscape level to enable these kinds of payment programs is it's going to be quite a long road. I think Vera and what they're doing is probably the leader in figuring that out, and so I'm excited to hear what they have to offer and say. But having worked on farms and spent a lot of time trying to understand how much soil carbon is being sequestered at the landscape level, it's usually a third or a quarter of what we would expect. And it's very hard to measure those incremental gains, especially when we start considering permanence and the dynamism, the equilibrium, and the saturation dynamics of that place. So, I mean, I would say these are sort of just calibrating points that I hope drive some energy into the conversation. And I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you, Philip. That definitely are some good conversation starting points there. And we really appreciate the perspective that you bring from working with the farming communities that are the ones who absolutely have to adopt any practices that are recommended for more sustainable farming. So I'm going to jump right into talking with Stefan. Stefan Jerka is the innovation manager at Vera, the organization that Philip just mentioned. Vera Carbon Standards operates carbon market platforms for the voluntary carbon marketplace. And Stefan, with his work at Vera, has been leading their development of carbon standards for soil carbon sequestration. So he's been working across the gamut of public and private sector entities, trying to understand how can we provide valid measurement and verification of carbon being sequestered in soils, primarily on farms, and how do we structure the market so that that attracts farmers to participate in these programs, but also provides confidence to investors that carbon will actually be stored for a relatively long duration of time. So I'm going to turn it over to Stefan now to talk about their work at Vera, where they're at in developing these standards and farmer participation. And then hopefully we'll have a few minutes for Q&A at the end. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne, and thanks for the opportunity to present and share our perspective. I'll try to keep my remarks brief, so we do have some time for Q&A at the end. But yeah, want to start out with just a quick overview of Vera and what we do, and then get into our work on soil carbon and agriculture. And I think starting with the points that Philip was just making around some of the real challenges around MRV and just the complexity of trying to do this credibly at scale. And I think we share at Vera that those concerns really, and to that end, we do not operate solely in the carbon space, but we have a number of other standards and initiatives that we're launching, and you can see some of those here, the logos at the bottom of the slide here around climate, community, and biodiversity, for example, well-established landscape scale, accounting framework, sustainable development verified impact standard, looking at which assesses progress towards the UN's sustainable development goals. So I just highlight that to note that while the rest of the slides that I'll present on are focused on carbon and the VCS program, which is our flagship program, we are exploring how to bring value to the broader soil health, right, and not just look at carbon, but take more of a holistic view on ecosystem perspective and things like water and even socioeconomic benefits. Next slide, please. So yeah, the VCS is our flagship program. Just real quickly here, some of the key elements include the standard itself, which sets out the rules and procedures for ensuring the integrity of greenhouse gas emission reduction claims. So that's kind of the orange part of the graphic, the middle of the circle, the core element. Then we have methodologies, which set out the specifics of how to do projects in a certain sector, all the rules and procedures to develop a carbon project, whether it's in forests or agriculture or an industrial sector. We have a component that's core to the program around independent auditing. These are third-party independent auditors that are reviewing, verifying, validating the projects and methodologies that are developed to ensure independence in that aspect. And lastly, there's a registry system. When projects are approved and verified, they are able to issue credits, which are then shown on VCS registry. Next slide, please. So this is a graphic just to illustrate the evolution of the broader carbon crediting space in the last 5 years or so. The different colors here on this graphic represent the many different carbon crediting programs, whether they're voluntary or compliance, and illustrates here that within the last couple of years, VCS, that's the light blue part of this graphic, has really taken off in terms of global volume of carbon credits issued. We surpassed the CDM in 2019 as the world's largest carbon crediting mechanism. Next slide, please. So another graph here to illustrate the recent interest and really surging interest in natural climate solutions. So these are opportunities to mitigate climate change via nature, whether it's forests, blue carbon and wetlands, or coastal systems, or agriculture. So it's pretty hard to see in the small graphic, but basically the light blue line in the center there represents all AFLU issuances. That's agriculture, forestry, and other land use. In other words, natural climate solutions. And you can see that spike in the last couple of years in terms of VCUs, that's Verra's VCS carbon credits issued. And I think this really reflects the recognition that natural climate solutions offer a host of co-benefits related to biodiversity, livelihoods, and a range of others, and agriculture certainly falls in that as well. Next slide, please. So what are we doing to advance this space on soil organic carbon accounting? We convened a expert ag land management working group earlier this year, and Johannes actually serves on that along with a range of other domain experts. And are very have gotten quite a bit of useful information and input to inform our work and thinking in this space. We're looking at new accounting methodologies. Just last week, approved a methodology that we think will introduce new opportunities, flexibility, and scalability in agriculture and including soil carbon. We're definitely interested in incorporating technology advances. I think these, for example, the sensors that Johannes was referring to, how can we bring those kinds of technologies into the MRV to reduce costs to achieve scalability? Next slide, please. So what are some of the actions we're taking to grow the market for soil organic carbon credits? We're looking at how to evaluate and assess non-permanence risk. That's the risk that soil carbon gains will be reversed over time due to natural events or maybe intentional reversals. So taking a closer look at our tool that analyzes that risk, also thinking about insurance products even. We're in conversations with reinsurance industry, early conversations about developing some insurance products to insure against non-permanence risk. We're looking to adapt our guidance around aggregation, how you cost effectively bring lots of diverse farmers into a single project to increase economies of scale. Additionality is one of these core carbon market concepts across all the carbon registries, and can be costly to assess on a project by project basis. We're scoping the development of a standardized method to determine additionality, which would allow for entire regions and or cropping practices to be deemed additional and kind of avoid that costly project by project additionality assessment. And lastly, the streamlined use of models. I think Johannes's point around models with intent is well taken. These are often highly complex, sophisticated models that require a lot of technical expertise and investments to make those more available to the general populace would be advantageous. I think I'll stop there. I'm just looking at the time just to leave us a minute or two for questions. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Stefan. That was really helpful. The most common question we got throughout the webinar today was around financing. So I appreciate you taking time to explain the carbon market and the process and where it's at Verra. So I know Lakeisha and Johannes can stay on for a few extra minutes since we're at the top of the hour now. Stefan and Philip, if you can stay with us too, that would be great, but I understand if you need to run. For our audience, this webinar is being recorded. So if you can't stick with us for the discussion, it will be available on Pecan Street's YouTube page by the end of the week. And you could just fast forward to check out the rest of this part. So I think we still have Philip on as well. I would love to just dive into some of the concerns that Philip raised and hear from the rest of the panel about your thoughts there, the challenges with taking this approach of really emphasizing compensating farmers for carbon sequestration as the primary vehicle to incentivize farmers to change towards regenerative farming practices that have all of these other co-benefits that have been kind of discussed today. Anybody want to take a stab?
I'm happy to share a little bit. So I don't necessarily know that when FAR thinks about kind of how we can affect change in the space, that that's the only mechanism, but it definitely is one, right? So we've also had thoughts around what impact could be, what impact would affecting like crop insurance, what that could have. I think there are lots of triggers in the space that would affect change, and definitely finance is one, but it's not necessarily the only one. It may be technical assistance. It may be having that like federal support to test out some of these technologies, right? So thinking about how we can maybe affect policy. We don't work in the policy space, but we know there are lots of partners that do. So the more that we can think about the barriers and have conversation around what we can do as a research funder, because we have our limitations, but there are other organizations that may be able to affect the insurance space, the finance space, the federal funding space, and hopefully it's an all hands on deck kind of effort together.
Yeah, I would just add, let's see. I think we recognize that there are inherent challenges to doing this kind of carbon accounting at the field level and aggregating and all the kind of complexities that come up with that. But I do think we have seen a lot of interest and from conversations with some project developers and private sector that carbon markets can perhaps provide sort of a stepping stone in that with the private sector kind of demand for carbon credits within supply chains and the technical assistance that some of the big agribusiness companies can lend and are also coming on board with the need to reduce emissions and sequester soil carbon. That it's kind of a combined approach so that it's not, just the carbon project in isolation, but kind of everything that comes with it. And, the transition will take some time. And I think the gains, as Philip pointed out, will not be immediate and they may not be as huge as we had hoped. But I think it's also, it's not just the soil carbon we need to be thinking about. It's the trace gases and it's reduced emissions from livestock, the sort of the whole package, right? And when you start to quantify those benefits, it can become attractive. And I think as the space grows, we'll really learn a lot about what's working well and where tweaks and technology can really help.
Yeah, no, that sounds all right. I'm completely on board with the 360 view of on the soil carbon, because you could easily imagine that if you just incentivize and financially reward the unit organic carbon in soil, maybe crop yields decline. If that's not plugged into the criteria somewhere, then that's of no use to the farmer with destroying livelihoods and incentivizing soil carbon storage. That's of course no good for anyone. Also because, and I would say what is more, I don't think a financial incentive is enough for farmer. The farmer is really the person, she is putting the carbon in the soil. She needs to reap benefits beyond a paycheck that might or might not come, or might not be sufficient incentive. It needs to be an improvement in what their daily business is. And if we're talking about a corn grower, then that farmer needs to grow more corn or better corn. If that's not happening, I have a hard time seeing that a carbon market will gain traction that rewards soil carbon. So it really needs to have non-soil carbon unit sequestration benefits for a farmer to make this a sustainable activity. And obviously then on the life cycle, as everybody mentioned, there are all kinds of trade-offs. So we absolutely need this 360 view.
Philip, do you want to add anything on that topic?
I think all those comments are great, and I think speak to the complexity and also the urgency to take the 360 view. You know, understanding how much carbon is going in the ground and knowing how much is there is a good thing to do for a lot of reasons. And so developing standards and protocols will inform, you know, many things, whether that's a market or whether that's policy or changing how the RMA, ties risk to loans. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons to measure carbon and create a universal standard around that with known uncertainty bounds. And so I'm all in favor of the 360. I think it's worth moving on. I think my comments are, I look for, what are the most catalytic levers to change the system. And, right now with where the cultural setting of the carbon markets is, I think it's a lot of hype, but it's going to be hard to generate the follow through at the balance sheet level, and so that kind of like crops are the potatoes, carbon is the gravy. That's kind of the approach that I like to talk with our farmers about, where, there is clear data, anecdotes and empirical data that building soil health, storing more carbon leads to net profitability. And so tying those things together in a very clear way, I think is a really critical sort of next step to learn, understand, and then communicate. There's a Lacane and Lundgren paper in 2018, which is one of the only papers out there that says greater soil carbon is correlated with net profitability. And so having that 360 holistic view, I think, is really critical. And that seems to be embodied by all of our guests and panelists. And so that's not only encouraging, but I think necessary.
We're at a very interesting intersection with farming and climate activism, climate change mitigation and adaptation. And, for decades and decades, as everybody on the panel knows, the soil sciences have been severely underinvested in. And now we're trying to leverage soils as this get out of jail free card on climate change without having this investment to have the knowledge of how to do that. We're talking about so many barriers right now to this potentially huge opportunity for climate change mitigation and adaptation, but also all of these other great benefits to community that we need. But we also have a timeline, right? If we want to really impact the changing climate and how that affects our Earth's natural systems for the next 100 years, we have maybe a handful of years left to do that as a species. I'd love to hear from each of the panelists what you would like to see done in this space over the next 3 years. And I'm leaving this space broadly for everybody to interpret that with their lens. Lakeisha, can we start with you?
Absolutely. So I think that you summed up a lot of the barriers that we think about at FAR. There's a limited amount of time. We have a lot to do and not a lot of time to do it. I think if I could see one thing in the next 3 years, it would be more coordination among efforts, because a lot of work is happening, right? But it's not happening together. And so sometimes it feels like some things are maybe a little duplicative, or we're not leveraging dollars effectively. I would love to see a huge investment in ag research, like out of the blue. That would be awesome. But if that doesn't happen and we kind of stay at the public investment dollar level for ag research, we just don't have enough funds to do everything that we want to do separately. So I would just love to see more effective communication and coordination and engagement with existing projects, such that maybe we're a bit more effective and we can be more targeted in our approach.
Sorry, Stefan, how about you next?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think practically bringing technologies and kind of big tech and supercomputing, AI remote sensing, all, there's so much happening, and it seems to be just growing exponentially, like bringing those types of technologies to bear, and the experts that are thinking about them into this space, I think within 3 years seems achievable, and seems like something that can really help move the needle. But I'll also add, maybe for more, not the carbon markets or purely Vera perspective, I like what Philip framed up and Matt Agriculture perspective, that it's really, kind of a paradigm shift. We need, technology is not going to solve this. There needs to be a broader recognition and value placed on, place-based interventions, and it's kind of the human values and the natural capital, all of that coming together, and that's kind of a broader awareness raising, and that goes well beyond carbon markets. So I think that's important as well.
Johannes?
I'm okay, thank you.
Okay. Philip?
Yeah, I mean, I think, just to echo those last statements, I think we need a cultural revolution that touches every part of society and flows from the values that we know that create good human economy, which is love, reciprocity, stewardship, neighborliness, living in the radical center, finding common ground. We need to go back to those virtues and anchor our work, all of our work, in that. When you're thinking about carbon markets, anchor into that, and really be unafraid and courageous about bringing that language and that story, which is just, since George Floyd's death, I feel totally ripped open by the need to go to my best virtues and operate from that place every day. And I would encourage everyone to return to those spiritual and moral moorings that guide our best relationships, to shape these kinds of solutions, and always be operating from that space. I mean, we can talk about policy and markets and all these things, but it comes down to using love as an animating force to guide the way society is shaped. So I would say it comes down to that, love.
I love that response. Johannes, I think maybe the final question to you, and then if anybody has a closing thought they want to leave the audience with, but you've been carrying out what I consider to be incredibly revolutionary research on soils for 20 years. And I think what I take away from a lot of your research around the soil microbiome, for example, is exactly what Philip's talking about. It's this really deep understanding of the beauty of soils. And we have this incredibly rich microbial ecosystem that exists within them when they're healthy and they communicate with electrical signals. I mean, it's just mind-blowing. How do you think that research can be translated or applied to actually changing the way that we treat our soils?
Yeah, wow, that's that almost goes again into the philosophical question. But I think there's echoing what the others have said, that there's something deeply human in our ways we connect and deal with soils, so I think that is really important to recognize, also in the way, not just because we feel a deep connection with it, but also we are connected. Our civilizations are connected with soils. The rise and demise of soil has always been connected to the rise and demise of societies, and it's no accident that humans and humus are the same word, and so we're talking about something that connects us very deeply. I think thinking about the soil ecosystem as a complex system that requires complex system science and systems analysis. It requires recognizing the diversity of organisms as well as the diversity of pore spaces and molecules and all of that. And it's very much puts the bridge to how we conduct ourselves in our societies. And I'm working with with a Black artist who's reflecting on these insights that what role diversity plays in resilience and persistence of soil carbon, and thinking about that, how that translates, and how persistence and resilience of human communities work. So I think it's a deep connection that we're looking at, and all the more we need to make this a very conscious and careful endeavor. We don't want to muck it up.
Thanks, Johannes. What a wonderful way to end this discussion that started so much around data and technology and ended with a whole lot of heart. And I thank everybody for joining us, especially our panelists for taking time to be with us today. Introduce these ideas and opportunities to a broader engineering audience. We hope it will yield a lot of great results going forward. We can send the slides out to anybody who's interested. Just shoot us an email and we'll get the slides over to you. And this video will be up on Pecan Street's YouTube page on Friday, I think. Thank you again, everybody. Take care. Bye.